KUAM News Hotspot is brought to you by Calvo Enterprises, Inc.
Growing tensions between the U.S. and China, especially over Taiwan, have seen both sides engaged in high-profile showcasing of their respective military might. But a recent in-depth report by Reuters reveals that there's also mounting friction that's out of view. The report suggests that subsea cables are now central to a U.S.-China tech war. Reuters cites data indicating that there are more than 400 cables carrying over 95% of all international internet traffic. And according to the report, in the past 4 years, the U.S. government has managed to tip the scales against China's top subsea company Huawei in at least 6 deals in the Asia-Pacific region. This includes a proposed cable connecting the Federated States of Micronesia, Nauru, and Kiribati. The potential for undersea cables to also be drawn into a conflict between China and Taiwan was brought into focus last month when cables connecting Taiwan with its Matsu Islands were cut. Taiwanese authorities stopped short, though, of accusing Beijing of deliberate sabotage. Coming up, we talk with Matulich, the founder of subsea cable company RTI, about the critical importance of the industry and the potential implications for Guam and the Marianas in the battle for dominance between the U.S. and China. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Hub. I'm Nestor Lecanto, and I'm pleased to welcome our guest this week. He's Matulich. He is the CEO of RTI, and Russ is here to talk to us about the extent of subsea cables in the region and the globe, and how that's now, according to a very well done article by Reuters, the central piece in the U.S.-China Tech War. Russ, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nestor. Half a day.
Half a day. Before we get into all that stuff, I wanted to maybe give you an opportunity to kind of set the table here and talk a little bit about your background and experience in the undersea cable industry.
Certainly. Thank you for the opportunity, first of all. Subsea cables have been part of my life for almost 3 decades, and RTI Cable builds, owns, and operates Asia's largest neutral network. The audience may not know that less than 1 cable per year is built across the Pacific, and in the last 10 years, a total of 6 have been built. RTI built 3. All 3 land in Guam. So we operate about 33,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable, and my background is on building, owning, and operating them. And prior to starting this company about 10 years ago exactly in March, I was head of Asia for the world's largest subsea cable builder at that time, called Tyco Telecom.
Yeah, a lot of people, because it's out of sight, out of mind kind of thing, may not understand the extent and importance of subsea cables to the regional and global economy. So please share with us.
Well, they're getting much more popular these days, that's for certain. I've been a big advocate for Guam over the years, big advocate for subsea cables. And it's very simple at the high level. Subsea cables are all about trade, education, communication, and national security. So they accelerate commercial trade. Without a cable, you don't have an economy. In terms of education, research and education can be done much more rapidly and much more efficiently. You're reaching out to, in the case of the island nations, to make quality of life better. National security is essential to everyone, and we can talk about some examples as to why. I think Guam would be very familiar with the 2017 cut of the Guam Saipan cable, and it put Saipan into the dark ages. I happened to be on Guam when that happened. Subsea cables are deemed critical infrastructure by the Office of the United States President, and they are very well protected. So I hope that sums it up.
Yeah, and I think Guam, as you mentioned, you've laid 3 cables to Guam as a landing, and Guam is growing as a landing spot for these transnational cables, if that's the correct
transoceanic or trans-Pacific, but we can call them cables if you like.
All right. Yeah, and talk about Guam, and it's a strategic location. I think that's one of the things about Guam. It's a strategic location, not just for cables, but it has been militarily too.
Yeah, well, Guam was pretty amazing. I met a few companies there, Docomo Pacific and GTA and IT&E. So I'm well familiar with Guam. I've had the privilege of meeting the former governor, meeting the current governor, Governor Liu. So I'm super grateful that RTI has been given the opportunity to operate our business there. But in terms of Guam, I always looked at it this way. Guam is geographically perfect, as I like to put it. In between Japan, Australia, and then a gateway to Asia. So geographically perfect, geopolitically neutral, somewhat, right? But it's based on U.S. law and therefore the rule of law. It has rule of law, which is essential for any cable, and then it has infrastructure. You can't own and operate a cable unless you can depend that once you land that cable will be well looked after by the government. So those are really the key categories for Guam in particular. What the reason why we put Guam first is, Guam was, of course, important. The big routes are Japan and then to the U.S. directly, and then Australia to the U.S. And we thought Guam was an efficient way to bring more business to Asia through what I call a diverse route. So we're number one and the number two routes. And one thing I'd add, Nestor, is that the thing about transporting critical data, 99% of all of the world's internet goes over fiber optic cables. Every day somebody uses a fiber optic cable, they just don't know it. And the thing about subsea cables is, in Guam in particular, is on a per capita basis, Guam has more cables landed than any other country or island nation on the world. So you have $3 billion of cables that are already landed and operating, and you have about $2.5 billion of cables that mostly connected there, but still not turned up. And it remains to be seen how long it will take to turn those cables up.
Yeah, and when we talk about landing cable, there's literally a process for laying the cables undersea, and that would seem to me to be a very complex process.
Yeah, I think I compared it. I compared it to watching a sea turtle documentary one time. In that, the sea turtles are born, they're under the sand, and at the break of dawn, they all race. Maybe 100 of them race to the water, and they get picked off by the seagulls and along the way. And maybe out of that 100, one makes it. And I would say those are probably the odds of getting a subsea cable done and completed, because it's not just about having a good idea. Everybody's got good ideas, and it's not just about drawing a line between point A to point B. Anybody can draw a line. It takes, well, as I like to put it, money doesn't build cables. Money is the least important of the 4 or 5 things that you have to do. Money doesn't build cables, people do. It's the relationships that get these things done.
All right. On that note, we will take a quick break, Russ, and when we come back, we'll talk about what we mentioned earlier and how the subsea cables are now central to the U.S.-China Tech War. We'll be right back. All right, and so we're back with Russ Matulich, who is the CEO of RTA, cable laying company internationally. Russ, one of the reasons I asked you to come on the show is a great article by Reuters, an expansive article. It talks about how subsea cables are now central to the U.S.-China Tech War. I'm wondering, first of all, what are your general thoughts on that?
That's the article by Mr. Brock, I take it, Joe Brock?
Yes.
Yeah, I think he did an excellent job. I think he did an excellent job. I'll put it that way.
All right. And what are your thoughts on that, though? And if you can elaborate further on, what the article was talking about, or how these cables are critical concern, particularly in the Pacific region.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned before, subsea cables are critical to any nation's digital security. And, without a cable, you don't have an economy. And so the United States is concerned about enemies, foreign and domestic. So, I'm not picking on China. I think Mr. Brock did an excellent job. And I think in the case of Mr. Brock's article, looked at a lot at the trade issues, really, with a Chinese-backed state entity versus a U.S. company, which is more of a trade issue with potential security implications down the road. And I think he did a phenomenal job laying that out. He also the article also talked about the tech wars, and I consider them tech and trade wars, and that's really what they are, because I think a few of us, the small community of maybe a few dozen of us that help shape the world's internet, it's or how it's carried anyway. It is, it's really excellent to see that the general public is gaining a knowledge of how subsea cables work and operate, because we talked earlier, getting them built is very difficult. The average cable takes about 7 years to get built. I think maybe 1 out of 100 make it over the finish line, and the people that build them are extraordinary. The engineers, you probably never met one. They're the ones that do all the work and get the least amount of credit. And it's the only industry I know, by the way, that you have to apply for the permit to begin with, and then you spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and at the end of that, you hope that you get the permit approved. But back to Mr. Brock's article, he also did an excellent job of stating, how complex these cables are, and the impact that they'll have on security. I think in his article he mentioned the State Department or USTDR had reached out to help sort of seal the deal, and that also is very helpful. It's not uncommon. When I was building cables in a commercial role at Tyco, I traveled on a U.S. trade mission to China, and we built a cable between China called TPE cable, which has been up since 2008. And that one it took a lot of state help to do that, USTDR, and I traveled with U.S. Ambassador to China, and then also with the Secretary of Commerce. So that was a big deal back then. It's a big deal now. I think what makes these things more important now is it's essential to a nation's not just trade anymore, but security, and that's really what Mr. Brock made clear to the general public.
Right. And also, I think, and maybe you could elaborate on this. A lot of these cable projects involve multinational ties, right? Different nations kind of getting into the project, and so because it will benefit them as well as the other countries that they need to communicate with. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, there's a direct correlation between GDP and a number of cables connected to a country, and it's not a chicken and egg thing. The more bigger economy you have, the more cables you're going to attract. So to have a cable land on your island, on your country, in your nation, brings tremendous economic benefit, billions and billions of dollars. Very hard to measure, but if you look at the way that the subsea cables work, it's a lot like the airlines. It's the same way. The same way you transport data, critical data, is the same way you transport people. You hop on an airplane, you go to another location, you get off that location, you go to another airline. In this case, I live in San Francisco. I'm taking a plane to Guam, and then I want to go to Japan, so I change from United to Asia Air. So that's the way that's the way that subsea cables transport data. I think in terms of the criticality of subsea cables, I think there's too few resources to build so many. Only maybe one or two get completed per year, transoceanic cables. And in the case of these big cables, they're consortium cables. So it's like the United Nations. You have to have unanimous agreement by, in the case of the CME cable, I think it was maybe 12 different entities. And it's very difficult because you got geopolitical differences, you've got cultural differences, religious, you got everything that makes a cable difficult is exemplified, and in terms of how complex it can be. So I would say you need a like a United Nations broker, like Kofi Annan was when he was head of the UN. He was bringing everybody together for a common goal and a common good, and that's what makes these cables so complex. And I would add that there's a new component to it, and Mr. Brock pointed it out, and that is that the security component. When you're connecting a cable, governments have the ability to, they govern what lands. It's sovereign territory, so they control what happens with that cable once it lands. As much as other countries would like to think it's their sovereign nation, it may not be. It lands in somebody else's yard. It's on their property. You have to obey their rules. And so I think the concern may be that some countries may be putting different types of malware, spyware, and things like that. I'm not an authority on that, so I wouldn't know, but I know that that's a concern for sure.
Yeah, and that's one of the primary focuses of that article that we're referencing is the number of attacks, maybe, or vulnerabilities and damage that has and more often now to these very important cables. What's your take on that?
Well, that would be interrupting communications is harmful to everyone. So you have all types of things that can happen. Although I've told stories that there are people that believe that you can put certain types of spyware on cables. You can't interrupt a cable without the cable owner knowing that somebody is cut under the water. And so really what it is, it's about more about things happening when they're on land. And they're not always, they're not always hackers or spies or foreign entities. Some of it's just general bad luck or a bad card or bad software. That's taken down a lot of different companies. So it's hard to speculate when there's, because I know there's been some recent outages on in Guam, and I think it was it Docomo? Docomo Pacific was having, and the thing about Docomo, it's an outstanding company run by Rod Boss is a great CEO, and they're a Japanese entity. So in terms of the quality integrity of network architecture, I would say nobody's better than Docomo on Guam, so it's difficult to know what I'm not close to the issues there, but it could have been anything. And I would say that sometimes it's a foreign entity or a disruptor or somebody just wants to make trouble, and sometimes it's just bad luck.
All right. On that note, we'll take another quick break and be back to talk about things a little bit closer to home here in the Western Pacific. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and before the break, we were talking about a little bit more implications for Guam and the Marianas and Micronesia. And what are the impacts, do you think, of what's going on maybe between China and the U.S.? Are there any implications for Guam and the Western Pacific?
Well, let's talk about the economic implications first. When the cable outage happened between Guam and Saipan in 2017, everything was out. The airports were out, welfare services, state services, hospitals, couldn't land a plane. You went to the ATM, they told you you didn't exist. So without a cable, you don't have anything because everything runs on the global economy. So the implication of not having connectivity for CNMI and the Pacific Island nations is significant. There's tremendous downside. We work very closely with the research and education community headed up by University of Hawaii and University of Guam locally, and they do an outstanding job in terms of education, putting education out to the island nations with organizations called PIRIN, which I think is Pacific Island Research Network. But to the larger question, what are the security implications? Well, with as I mentioned before, Guam's strategically important geographically, among other things, and there are U.S. People in the services on Guam. It's one of the larger bases, I think, in terms of housing people. But the being that close to the Pacific corridor with access to ships and access to airs is very helpful. It's very helpful to our trade. It's very helpful to our military. It's very helpful to the government of the United States. Without that presence, I think Guam would be worse off. I know there's always good and bad to everything, but I think overall that the U.S. government's presence on Guam has been very helpful to Guam and very helpful to the region. So I think having Guam be the hub, and Guam is a hub. It's one of 3 hubs between the United States and the rest of Asia. It's one of 3 hubs between 4 or 5 billion people and the United States, and so it's just Japan, Guam, and Australia, and the second most important hub in all of Asia, and maybe all of the world right now, is Guam. So I think the security implications are super obvious. Without having Guam, be the responsible manager and custodian of these cables would be a challenge for the United States, for the United States economy, and for our U.S. efforts in the Asia Pacific region.
Yeah, you mentioned Docomo and the apparent, I don't know if it was a cyber attack or some kind of hacking, and it also happened at the Guam Memorial Hospital right around the same time, or
Hmm.
shortly before, which the FBI is investigating. And I don't think subsea cables may necessarily be implicated in this, but are there some vulnerabilities with the subsea cables that are very important to Guam?
Well, if I knew of them, I probably wouldn't mention them. But the vulnerabilities don't lie in the subsea cables themselves. I mean, anything built by humans is going to have some misgivings, right? But I think that when you own and operate a cable, with all cables, you have to know, who are your partners, and what are their backgrounds? Can you rely on them? Will they execute when the time is needed? Because it's not just these upcoming potential trade war issues or cybersecurity or spying. It's also force majeure, earthquakes, typhoons. Guam's well familiar with inclement weather. So you need people you can trust on the ground that will look after your assets. Because the funny thing about cables, you've got $200 million of assets going under the ocean, and it stays pretty stable into the ocean. When it gets on land and touched by humans, that's when you have the problems. So you need somebody. It's the most vulnerable part of a 200 some odd $million asset. You have to have people that know what they're doing and have good connections, and that you can trust.
All right. On that note, Russ, we're going to take one real short break and be back to wrap up the show. Please stay with us. All right, we're back with Russ Matulich, who is the CEO of RTI, a global cable company. Finally, Russ, I just wanted to get your thoughts on going forward in terms of global data and communications and how subsea cables fit into that. What are your expectations? What can you shed light on for our viewers about where that's headed?
In terms of improvement of the quality of life,
Sure.
I think, well, there's a few different aspects. One is the acceleration of research and education. When you have these research organizations that collaborate, and they have big pipes that can connect and analyze data, they can accelerate that analysis from everything from robotics to AI, and so they can do 10,000 times more research in a much shorter span of time, and that will do everything from helping to cure some diseases to help resolving some things with terms of nature and pollution and all the things that continue to plague mankind. So that's great. The research and education community has access to big pipes now, and they can do a lot more studying, a lot more research very, very quickly. Another component is in terms of Chad. Chad's going to be a big deal, and in fact, it's a threat to these companies. And I think Elon Musk is genius for throwing it out there, because it's not just the yellow pages, on the internet. Chad's all about doing some heavy analysis and thinking. Now, it's still built by humans, so it's still fallible, and I'm not expert at it by any stretch. But what I am interested in watching is seeing the development of that, and because what you have with just data, static data, is you can get information, but what about the learning? What about accelerating critical thinking? The thing that the challenges today are development of critical thinking skills and abilities in a very complicated environment. So I think that Chad will not hurt that. There are people that believe that it's going to hurt that. I think it'll help it, because the minds that use them will have to be able to think more creatively in terms of what they're going to use Chad for, right? But so I think look for accelerated and improved education, because we have to do education differently than we do it now. And in terms of leveling the playing field, the other thing that Elon Musk did, and I give him credit for, is creating a fight. I don't want to say anything stronger than that, between the engineers and the entrepreneurs and the big companies. Much of the innovation is coming from the individuals, the entrepreneurs, and the engineers. And so So I think they can live anywhere and do anything. You don't have to be, in downtown Tokyo or downtown San Francisco or in Silicon Valley. You can be anywhere and develop anything. And thanks to the internet and more accelerated subsea cables, you have access to tons of education. Or tons of tons of data at your fingertips. You just have to know how to critically analyze it. So I think it's look for more development of more interesting things. You're at the end of a development stage when the only new thing coming up on your iPhone is the color. That really doesn't matter, right? If you talk to people and they're looking at different phones. I'm not picking on any one company, but the color isn't an innovation. So I think true innovation comes from the small entrepreneurs. So that's what I'm excited to and hopeful and really interested in watching. And we do a lot of incubation of here at RTI of the entrepreneurial community because we level the playing field for them. And I think that's another thing we're leveling the playing field. The acceleration of new cables will level the playing field, but you have to be careful. We have to be careful as a society. There are the cables that control the content, and that's a business model. And there are other private cables, neutral cables like us, and we don't have we don't carry content. We're the Switzerland of bandwidth, right? We just transport data from point A to point B the same way that an airplane does. So there has to be some. We, as a public, generally speaking, we should keep an eye on making sure that we are ensuring private cables. Without private cables, there is no great internet. You have to let data move, and when you're the owner of a cable and you're owner of content, you're the one that controls which data comes out first. And as a neutral cable owner or private cable owner, we're just transporting the data. So I would say that if there's a healthy mix of cables built, private and public, collaboration, partnership, you'll see better trade, education, communication. You'll see more interesting products and services, and acceleration of research and education. And hopefully, our countries can get along just a little bit better so that we can focus more on making people's lives better and less on trying to go to war with each other.
Yeah, and as you say, the subsea cables provide the kind of the highway for that. And it's interesting that you mentioned ChatGPT because we just did a show on that last week. And once AI opened up that open source and made it available to millions and millions of people, which hundreds and millions of people are now, and that's where the innovation is. Like you say, I mean, individuals are going to come up with ideas on how to capitalize on that, and hopefully it's mostly for good. There might be some bad, so that's where the regulators will come in. But yeah, that's the opening up a whole new world, and the exponential growth of that is just amazing. So
yeah, I didn't see that. Please send that to me when afterwards. That's great.
Will do. Thank you so much. Russ Matulich is the CEO of RTI. Thanks for sharing your knowledge, sir.
Thank you very much, Esther. You have a good morning.
All right. I'm Nestle Content. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you again next week on The Hub.